Henry Louis Wallace was born in Barnwell, South Carolina in November of 1965. He was raised by a mother who was reported to be mentally and verbally abusive. Wallace attended Barnwell High School, where he was a cheerleader and elected to the student council. He graduated in 1983 and became the DJ for a local radio station. He ended up joining the Navy in 1985. That same year, he married his high school sweetheart, Moretta Brabham. In 1992, he was honorably discharged from the Navy. During his time in the Navy, Wallace began using different drugs, including crack cocaine. He was issued several warrants for burglary in the Seattle metro area. In January 1988, Wallace was arrested for breaking into a hardware store. He pled guilty to second-degree burglary and was sentenced to 2 years probation, which he rarely attended the meetings for. On March 8, 1990, Wallace murdered 18-year-old Tashonda Bethea, a Barnwell High School student. He then dumped her body in a lake in his hometown. Her body was not discovered for several weeks, and Wallace was questioned about this as well as the attempted essay of a 16-year-old Barnwell girl, but was never charged. By this time, his marriage had fallen apart, and he was fired from his job as a chemical operator. In February of 1991, he broke into the radio station he once DJ'd for to steal items he later pawned. In November 1991, Wallace relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina, where he found work as a Taco Bell manager. He used this position to get close to several female coworkers as well as their female friends and family, who he ended up assaulting and strangling, which was his typical MO. He ended up killing a total of 11 women in North and South Carolina, most of them being young college girls. Wallace was finally apprehended in 1994. In March of that year, Charlotte police increased their patrols after the bodies of 2 young black women were found at the Lake Apartments complex, which is where Wallace's last 3 victims lived. He still managed to sneak in, rob, strangle, and assault Deborah Ann Slaughter, who he stabbed 38 times in the chest before taking money in her apartment for drugs. Her body was found on March 12, 1994, and Wallace was arrested the following day. He spent 12 hours confessing to the murders, and he now sits on death row after being given 9 consecutive death sentences. In 1998, Wallace married a former prison nurse, Rebecca Torrijas, in a ceremony next to the state's execution chamber.
Henry Louis Wallace murdered 11 women before his March 1994 arrest in Charlotte. He was dubbed the Charlotte Strangler and Taco Bell serial unaliver because he had met or connected with most of his victims while working at a fast food chain he was the manager of. 10 of the victims were his friends or acquaintances, including 3 of the women worked at the restaurant Taco Bell, and 1 was the roommate of his girlfriend. Former Detective Gary McFadden said, Wallace would form a friendship or establish a trust with his victims before he would take their lives. The victims felt comfortable with him because he portrayed himself as a big brother, or more as a good friend. One of the Wallace victims, Shauna Hawk, who worked at Taco Bell, was unalived by Wallace. Her life was taken by someone who she considered to be her friend. Wallace was also her manager at Taco Bell and attended her funeral. In the final days before his arrest, he murdered 3 women in a span of 4 days, and 2 of these women lived in the same apartment complex. One of those women was Brandy Henderson. She was 18 years old and living with her boyfriend at the time. The 2 had recently welcomed their newborn son. That evening, after her boyfriend went to work, she was on the phone with her cousin when Wallace showed up at her apartment, and she invited him in, saying, "Lock the door behind you." Her cousin George Burnell said he didn't know who he was at the time, but didn't worry because it seemed like she trusted him. That same night, Wallace raped and unalived Brandy while she held her son. Wallace also tied a pair of shorts around the baby's neck to stop his crying, according to the investigators, but the baby survived. Wallace was also arrested on March 12, 1994, the same day the body of his final victim was discovered. Shauna Hawk's mother, a victim of Wallace, says she believes that the police missed obvious connections because of the race of her daughter and status of Wallace's victims. There was no level of caring and obvious misconnections. She said that her daughter was blatantly ignored. Wallace told police he started having violent fantasies of dominating women after he witnessed a gang rape at the age of 8. At the age of 16, he attempted his first raping. It was a friend's younger sister. Eventually, he started having rough intercourse with women of the night street workers, he said. He joined the U.S. Navy in 1985 at the age of 20 and married a high school classmate while on leave. The marriage was shortly lived. Wallace committed his first raping in 1987 in Seattle, where he was stationed. The Navy honorably discharged him in 1992 after he was caught stealing, and then he returned home to South Carolina. Most people who spoke of Wallace, the Taco Bell manager, stated he was a good person. After his arrest, one of the victim's mothers says she found out about his arrest on TV, followed by his photo, and she collapsed with such force and shock to the floor. She hit her head and started bleeding. She was in disbelief. Wallace was sentenced January 1997 to death for 9 murders, rape, robbery, and unwanted intercourse offenses. In 1998, he married a former prison nurse in a ceremony at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he remains on death row.
I am the notorious American serial killer Henry Louis Wallace, and my real nickname is the Taco Bell Killer. I'll tell you my story, and you're going to be shocked. I was born in 1965 in the town of Barnwell, South Carolina. My father abandoned us, and I was raised by a very strict mother in poverty. I had to wear my sister's hand-me-downs. Sometimes our mother would make my sister and me whip each other. I believe her actions contributed to who I became later in life. I wasn't a bad student, but balancing school and work was impossible due to lack of time, so I was kicked out of every college I attended. In 1984, I enlisted in the U.S. Navy, where I served for 4 years. I even got married, but my life with my wife fell apart. I started using not good substances, and that's when the real horror began. I committed a few petty crimes involving theft and initially got probation, but later served a few months in jail. After my release, I worked for several years as a cook and assistant manager at fast food chains like Taco Bell. My first serious crimes were spontaneous. On International Women's Day, March 8, 1990, I strangled Betty, a high school student from the town of Barnwell. I left her by a lake, and she was found days later. Yes, the police found me, but due to lack of evidence, I was released. After that, things got even worse. Follow me to hear the rest of the story. Leave a comment for part 2, Henry Wallace.
Who knew going to Taco Bell could be so dangerous? My name is Henry Louis Wallace, better known as the Taco Bell Strangler. I grew up with an abusive single mother, but my childhood was not all bad. In high school, I was popular meeting my future wife, and eventually joined the Navy at 20. I was honorably discharged 8 years later. However, during my service, I became a drug addict and committed a robbery. Once leaving the service, my wife left me, and my life began to unravel as my drug addiction worsened. Once moving home with my mother in the Charlotte area, I began to do unspeakable things to women before strangling them to death. Typically, I would target women who were related to the Taco Bell I was working at. I would also rob them after they passed on. By the time of my capture, I committed 11 murders. Once caught, I confessed and was given the death sentence. Today, I am still waiting on death row for my sentence. Looking back now with a clear head, I regret what I did. Those women did not deserve that end to serve my unspeakable needs.